5 Apache widows appeared at Elias Monroe's cabin door on the coldest night of 1882, barefoot and bleeding in the Colorado snow. Behind them, torchlights flickered through the trees. The same ranchers who'd burned their shelter and murdered their husbands were still hunting. Elias had one choice: turn them away and live with silence, or open his gate and face the violence he'd spent 5 years running from. What happened next changed 6 lives forever. Stay until the end and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The wind that winter didn't whisper, it screamed. Elias Monroe had grown accustomed to its voice, the way it rattled the pine shutters of his cabin and moaned through the canyon walls like something wounded and wild. He'd built his home deliberately far from Wolf Hollow, 15 miles up into the Colorado Territory, where the land grew too steep for cattle and too cold for neighborly visits. The isolation suited him. After 12 years as an Army scout witnessing atrocities that had no names in polite conversation, Elias had learned that silence was the only honest companion left to a man with too much blood on his conscience. His days followed a rhythm as predictable as the seasons. Dawn meant feeding the 6 Angora goats that provided him milk and occasional meat. Mornings were for chopping wood, endless, numbing work that kept his hands busy and his mind mercifully blank. Afternoons he spent checking his trap lines for rabbit and marten. Their pelts, his only currency when he descended to town twice a year for flour, coffee, and ammunition. Evenings belonged to the goats again, and to the bottle of whiskey he rationed with religious discipline, allowing himself 2 fingers each night while the fire burned low and shadows danced across log walls he'd chinked himself with moss and clay. He spoke aloud only to the goats, who he'd named after Army generals he'd served under: Sherman, Grant, Sheridan, Custer, Hancock, and Lee. It was his private joke watching proud men's names attached to stubborn animals who defecated wherever they pleased and showed no respect for authority. Sherman, the alpha male, had a particular talent for escaping his pen and eating Elias's vegetable starts before they could establish roots. One day, Elias told Sherman on that particular December afternoon, his breath crystallizing in the air between them, "One day I'm going to make stew out of you and not feel an ounce of guilt about it." Sherman chewed thoughtfully on a mouthful of hay and stared back with horizontal pupilled eyes that suggested he knew the threat was empty. The temperature had been dropping for 3 days straight, diving well below zero at night. Elias had reinforced the goat shelter with extra pine boughs and brought in twice the usual hay. His own cabin stood solid, built from ponderosa logs he'd felled, and stripped himself with a stone fireplace that drew smoke cleanly up through a chimney he'd laid rock by careful rock. The roof was triple-layered logs, then birch bark, then sod, and had survived 4 winters without a single leak. Inside his possessions were few: a rope bed with a corn husk mattress and wool blankets, a table and 2 chairs he'd built from split log shelves holding his tin plates and cups, a trunk containing his old Army uniform, which he never opened, and his rifles, a Henry repeater, and a Sharps buffalo gun kept cleaned and loaded above the door. It was a life reduced to its essentials, scrubbed clean of everything but survival. Exactly what he'd wanted. The sun was already sinking behind the western ridge when Elias finished securing the goat pen, checking twice that the gate latch was properly fastened against Sherman's clever hooves. The sky had turned that particular shade of winter violet that promised another brutal night, and the wind carried the smell of snow, a clean metallic scent that any man who'd spent years in these mountains learned to recognize. He was halfway to his cabin, thinking about coffee and the rabbit he'd skinned that morning for supper, when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Elias froze, every muscle tensing with an instinct that had kept him alive through the war and the bloody years after. He turned slowly, scanning the tree line where ponderosa pine stood black against the darkening sky. For a long moment, there was nothing but wind and the creaking complaint of frozen branches. Then he saw them. 5 figures emerging from the forest, moving slowly against the snow. Even at a distance, even in the failing light, Elias could see they were women. They walked in a ragged line, supporting each other, their dark hair hanging loose and their clothing inadequate for the killing cold. The one in front moved with determination despite an obvious limp. Her right hand pressed against the shoulder of the woman beside her. Elias's hand went instinctively to the Colt revolver at his hip, then stopped. They weren't armed. They weren't moving like a threat. They were moving like people who had nowhere else to go. As they drew closer, details emerged that made Elias's jaw tighten. They were Apache. He recognized the style of their buckskin dresses, though the garments were torn and stained dark with what could only be blood. None of them wore shoes or moccasins, their feet wrapped in rags that left bloody prints in the snow. The woman in front had a cut across her cheek that had scabbed over badly, and her eyes, when they finally met his across 30 yards of frozen ground, held something Elias hadn't seen in another person's face for longer than he could remember. Not fear, not desperation, dignity. She stopped 10 feet from his gate, her companions forming a loose semicircle behind her. The youngest couldn't have been more than 16, shivering violently and trying to hide the way her left foot bled freely onto the snow. The others ranged from perhaps 20 to somewhere past 40, all bearing marks of violence, bruises, cuts, torn clothing, and all standing despite everything that had clearly been done to them. "We need a place," the leader said. Her English was clear, her voice rough from cold but steady. "Just until the storm passes." Elias looked at the sky. The storm she meant wasn't the one coming tonight. It was the one they'd already survived, the one that was probably still hunting them. He should have said no. Every instinct developed through years of deliberate isolation told him to send them away to preserve the careful distance he'd built between himself and the world's violence. These women carried trouble with them like a visible shadow. Whoever had hurt them would come looking. And Elias had sworn 5 years ago, when he'd walked away from his last army contract and headed into these mountains, that he was done with other people's wars. But he looked at them standing there in the snow, bleeding and barefoot, and refusing to beg, and he saw something else. He saw the Washita River in winter 1868, when he'd scouted for Custer and watched soldiers cut down women and children in a dawn raid. He saw the faces that had haunted him ever since, the ones that visited his dreams and made him understand why he drank exactly 2 fingers of whiskey each night anymore, and the memories became unbearable any less, and they never faded enough to sleep. He saw a chance to pay a debt he knew could never truly be paid. Without a word, Elias walked to the gate and opened it, swinging it wide and stepping aside. The leader's eyes narrowed slightly, searching his face for the trap, the angle, the price that would be demanded later. Elias met her gaze and said nothing, just held the gate and waited. After a long moment, she nodded once and walked forward. The others followed, moving like ghosts through the failing light, as the youngest limped past him, leaving a trail of blood drops that looked black against the white snow. Elias felt something shift in his chest, a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was there, suddenly growing heavier. He closed the gate behind them and followed toward his cabin, watching them huddle together on his small porch, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. "Inside," he said, moving past them to open the door. The rush of warmth from the fire he'd banked earlier made them all gasp. Elias stepped aside and watched them enter his sanctuary, the space that had been his alone for 5 years, now suddenly full of shivering bodies and the smell of blood and smoke and human suffering. The leader turned to face him as the others moved instinctively toward the fireplace, their hands outstretched to heat that must have felt like salvation. "I'm Naomi," she said. "This is Tala, the youngest still bleeding. Kayamara and Ruth." Elias nodded, closing the door against the wind. "Elias." "We won't steal from you," Naomi continued, her eyes steady despite her exhaustion. "And we'll leave as soon as it's safe." "When will that be?" Elias asked, though he already knew the answer. Naomi's silence confirmed it. Safe was a luxury they couldn't afford to count on. Elias moved past them to his shelves, pulling down the tin basin he used for washing. He filled it from the water barrel by the door, then set it on the iron hook over the fire to heat. From his trunk, he retrieved his field medical kit, an old army surplus box containing bandages, carbolic acid needle and catgut thread, and a half-empty bottle of laudanum. "Let me see the feet," he said, kneeling by the youngest girl, Tala. She looked at Naomi, who gave a small nod. Slowly, Tala unwrapped the bloody rags from her left foot, revealing deep lacerations across the sole and several toes gone purple with frostbite. Elias had seen worse in the war, but seeing it on a girl barely old enough to marry made something hot and angry coil in his stomach. He worked in silence, cleaning the wounds with warm water and carbolic acid that made Tala bite down on her hand to keep from crying out. The others watched, their faces unreadable. When he'd finished bandaging Tala's foot, he moved to the next woman, then the next methodically treating lacerations, burns, bruises, and the beginnings of frostbite. Naomi's turn came last. She sat on his chair with her back straight, offering her feet without hesitation. Her soles were torn but less damaged than the others. She'd sacrificed her own moccasins. Elias realized, wrapping them around someone else's feet. "The cut on your face," he said, threading the needle, "needs stitches." "I know. It'll scar." "Good," Naomi said flatly. "Then I'll remember." Elias held her gaze for a moment, then nodded and began stitching. She didn't flinch even when the needle pierced sensitive skin near her eye. Her jaw set, and she stared at the wall behind him while he worked. And Elias found himself wondering what kind of strength it took to walk 15 miles through snow with bare feet and a face wound that must have been screaming agony with every step. When he'd tied off the last stitch, he sat back and studied his work. It was clean and would heal straight. The scar would run from her left cheekbone to just below her ear, a reminder, as she'd said. "Thank you," Naomi said quietly. Elias stood and moved to his stove, where he began preparing food, more food than he'd cooked at once in years. He had the rabbit, and he added dried beans he'd put up last summer, wild onions from his root cellar, and the last of his potatoes. While it cooked, he pulled out his spare blankets and spread them near the fire. The women watched in silence. They were warm enough now that they'd stopped shivering, but their faces remained guarded, waiting for the moment when kindness would reveal its price. That moment didn't come. Elias served the stew in his tin bowls. There were only 4, so he gave them those and ate his own portion from the pot, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall. They ate with a hunger that spoke of days without food, but even in their desperation they ate quietly, carefully, like people who had learned not to draw attention to themselves. When the bowls were empty and darkness had fully claimed the world beyond the cabin walls, Elias spoke for the first time since treating their wounds. "I've got a woodshed out back. Walls are solid, got a stove I use in spring when the goats are kidding. I'll get it warm for you." "We can sleep here," Naomi said, gesturing to the floor by the fire. "The shed's warmer, more private." Elias stood pulling on his heavy coat. "And you'll have a door you can bar from the inside." The implication hung in the air. "I'm giving you a way to protect yourselves from me." Naomi's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been surprise flickering across her features. She exchanged glances with the other women, then nodded. "Thank you," she said again, and this time there was something different in her voice, a crack in the armor, a note of genuine gratitude that seemed to surprise even her. Elias spent the next hour preparing the shed, stoking its small stove, until the space glowed with heat, spreading all his spare blankets and furs, bringing in water and the remaining stew. It was cramped for 5 people, but it was warm and secure with a solid door and a bar that could be dropped into place from the inside. When he led them out through the snow, Sherman and the other goats bleated in confusion from their nearby pen. Tala laughed a small, startled sound that seemed to shock her at Sherman's indignant expression. "He thinks he should be sleeping in the warm shed," Elias explained. Surprising himself with the comment, "What's his name?" Tala asked, her voice soft. "Sherman, after General Sherman." Mara, who hadn't spoken until now, made a sound that might have been a laugh. "You named a goat after the man who burned his way across the South." "Seemed fitting," Elias said. "He's got the same talent for destruction." This time several of them smiled, and Elias felt that weight in his chest shift again, pressing against something that might have been his heart. At the shed door, Naomi turned back to face him. In the light spilling from inside her sutured face looked severe, almost warrior-like. "Why?" she asked simply. Elias could have pretended not to understand. He could have deflected or lied or offered one of a dozen easy answers that would have protected the wall he'd built around himself. Instead, he found himself telling the truth. "Because I've seen what happens when good men do nothing," he said quietly. "And I'm tired of being that man." Naomi held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly as if he'd passed some test he hadn't known he was taking. "The men who did this," she said, her voice dropping low, "they might come looking. I know. They're drunk and angry and they like hurting people. I know that too. We can leave." "No," Elias interrupted, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. You stay until you're healed enough to travel properly. Until then, anyone who comes looking will have to go through me. He said it simply without bravado, stating it as fact. Naomi seemed to recognize the difference between a promise made for show and one made in earnest. Then we'll try not to bring you trouble, she said. Trouble's already here, Elias replied. Has been for a long time. At least now it's trouble worth having. He left them then, walking back through the snow to his cabin, which felt emptier and colder than it had in 5 years. He added wood to the fire and sat in his chair, the bottle of whiskey in his hand, but unopened, staring into the flames and thinking about the choices that had led him to this moment. Outside, the wind howled its ancient song of isolation and cold, but inside the woodshed 6 lives had collided in the darkness. 5 women who had survived the unspeakable, and 1 man who had finally stopped running from his past. The storm was coming. It had always been coming. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Elias Monroe was ready to face it. He poured his 2 fingers of whiskey, raised the tin cup in a silent toast to the weight pressing against his heart, and drank while the fire burned low and the night deepened outside his small circle of warmth and light. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring. Tonight, 6 strangers had found shelter in the snow, and silence had been broken by something neither Elias nor Naomi had expected to find in the frozen Colorado mountains. A fragile, tentative beginning of trust between pain and possibility, between people who had every reason to give up on humanity, but who had chosen against all odds to try one more time. Dawn arrived with the kind of cold that made breathing painful. Elias woke before first light, as he always did his body, trained by years of military routine to rise when darkness still held the world. He dressed quickly, pulling on wool layers and his heavy coat, then stepped outside into air so frigid it burned his lungs. The sky was beginning to pale in the east, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pearl and rose. His breath hung in clouds around his face as he made his way to the goat pen, expecting to find Sherman and his companions huddled together for warmth, waiting impatiently for their morning feed. Instead, he found the pen already cleaned fresh hay distributed and water brought from the creek that ran behind his property. The goats were contentedly chewing their water bucket, sitting on a flat stone near the small fire someone had built to keep it from freezing. Elias stood staring at the scene for a long moment, confusion giving way to understanding. He turned toward the woodshed and saw smoke rising from its chimney, but the door stood open now and the women were gone. A flash of panic gripped him. Had they left in the night? Had someone come for them? Then he heard voices from behind his cabin speaking in Apache. He followed the sound and stopped at the corner, watching a scene that made something twist in his chest. All 5 women were working. Naomi was repairing a section of his fence that had been damaged by a fallen branch weeks ago, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the bandages on her feet. Kaya was at the creek filling water buckets and hauling them with a yoke across her shoulders. Mara had somehow found his mending basket, a collection of torn clothing he'd been ignoring for months, and was sitting on a stump with needle and thread, her fingers flying through repairs. Ruth was gathering kindling, building a neat stack by his cabin door. And Tala, the youngest, with the badly injured foot, was sitting on his porch steps, with a knife methodically peeling and cutting the wild onions from his root cellar, her damaged foot elevated on a piece of firewood. They had been awake for perhaps an hour, maybe more, working in silence while he slept, working despite injuries that should have kept them bedridden for days. Working because that was what survivors did. They found ways to be useful to justify their presence, to prove they weren't burdens, even when their bodies screamed for rest. Elias cleared his throat, and 5 heads turned toward him in unison. For a fraction of a second, fear flickered across their faces, the instinctive response of people who had learned that male attention often preceded pain. Then recognition settled, and the fear faded, replaced by careful neutrality. "Morning," Elias said, his voice rough from sleep. "Good morning," Naomi replied, setting down the fence rail she'd been positioning. "We thought we should earn our keep." "You're injured," Elias said flatly. "You should be resting." "We're alive," Naomi countered, her tone equally flat. "That means we work." They stared at each other across 15 feet of snow-covered ground, 2 people who understood that survival often meant pushing through pain because stopping meant giving up, and giving up meant death. Elias broke the standoff first, shaking his head. At least let me make coffee before you repair everything I've been too lazy to fix for 6 months. The corner of Naomi's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. Coffee would be good. He went inside and built up the fire, then filled his battered coffee pot with water and ground, setting it on the stove to boil. While it heated, he mixed cornmeal with water and a little precious sugar, frying up Johnny cakes in his cast-iron skillet. It wasn't much, but it was hot and filling, and he'd learned in the army that a warm breakfast could make even the worst day bearable. When the coffee was ready and the Johnny cakes were stacked on his largest tin plate, he stepped outside and called them in. They came hesitantly, as if expecting him to change his mind to demand payment for kindness to reveal the trap that must surely exist somewhere in this arrangement. But Elias simply gestured to the table, poured coffee into every cup and container he owned, including 2 empty cans, and divided the Johnny cakes evenly. Then he took his own portion and sat on the floor again, his back against the wall, eating while they stood uncertainly in his small cabin. "Sit," he said, around a mouthful of cornmeal. "Food's hot now. Won't be in 10 minutes. Slowly, carefully, they sat. Naomi took one of the chairs, Tala the other, and the remaining 3 settled on the floor near the fire. They ate quickly, efficiently, still watching him from the corners of their eyes. "You worked for someone before?" Elias asked Naomi, noting how expertly she'd repaired his fence. "My husband was a carpenter," she said after a pause. "For the agency. He taught me." The past tense sat heavy between them. Elias didn't ask what happened to her husband. He didn't need to. "And you?" He directed the question to Mara, who was sewing patches on his shirt even while eating breakfast. "My mother was a seamstress," Mara said quietly, her English carrying a stronger accent than Naomi's. "She taught all her daughters, said a woman who could mend could always survive." "She was right," Elias said. They continued eating in silence for a while, but it was different now, less tense, more companionable. When the food was gone and the coffee drunk, Elias stood and began cleaning up. To his surprise, Naomi remained seated, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You keep looking at us like you're waiting for something," she said finally. Elias paused in his washing, then set down the tin plate he'd been scrubbing. "I'm not waiting for anything. Every man wants something." "Not this one." Naomi's eyes narrowed. "The ranchers who came to our camp, they wanted land. The sheriff who looked the other way, he wanted their money. The agency agent who told us to leave or face arrest, he wanted us gone. Everyone wants something." Elias dried his hands slowly, choosing his words with care. "I want you to heal. I want you to be safe. And when you're ready to leave, I want you to have somewhere to go. That's all." "Why?" It was the same question she'd asked the night before, but this time there was genuine confusion in her voice, as if his answer hadn't made sense when filtered through everything she knew about men and their motivations. Elias sat back down, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped between them. 14 years ago, I scouted for the 7th Cavalry. I was at Washita River when Black Kettle's village was attacked. I watched soldiers kill women and children who were sleeping under a flag of truce. I watched them burn lodges with people still inside. I watched and I did nothing because following orders seemed more important than following my conscience." He looked up, meeting Naomi's eyes directly. "Every one of you standing in that snow last night, I saw Black Kettle's people in your faces. I saw another chance to choose differently, so I did." The cabin had gone completely silent. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. "You think this makes up for that?" Naomi asked, her voice neither accusatory nor forgiving, simply curious. "No," Elias said honestly. "Nothing makes up for that. But maybe it means I'm not the same man I was then." Naomi studied him for a long moment, then stood. "My husband's name was James. He took a Christian name when he worked for the agency, but his real name was Running Deer. The ranchers came to our camp drunk on whiskey and mean with it. They said we were on their land even though we'd been there for 3 winters and the agency told us we could stay. They started shooting. James tried to talk to them. They shot him first." She spoke without emotion, as if reciting facts about someone else's life. But Elias saw how her hands clenched at her sides, how a muscle jumped in her jaw near the fresh stitches. "Kaya's husband died trying to protect the children," Naomi continued. "Mara's husband was shot running for help. Ruth's husband was killed pushing her out of the way. Tala's older brother, she's not married yet, died with a gun in his hand that he never got a chance to fire. She paused, letting the weight of those deaths settle in the space between them. They burned our lodges, took what they wanted, left us for dead in the snow. Naomi's voice had gone flat mechanical. We walked 2 days to reach you. Tala's foot got cut on the second day, stepped on a broken bottle someone threw in the creek. We could see smoke from your chimney for 6 hours before we got close enough to ask for help. 6 hours of wondering if you'd turn us away. 6 hours of knowing we'd die if you did. Elias felt the words like physical blows. I'm sorry, he said, knowing how inadequate it sounded. Don't be sorry, Naomi said sharply. Sorry doesn't bring them back. Sorry doesn't change what happened. Just... She trailed off, seeming to struggle with words. Just don't lie to us. Don't pretend you're something you're not. If there's a price for this shelter, tell us now. There's no price, Elias said firmly. You stay as long as you need. You work if it makes you feel better about staying, but you're not obligated. And when you leave on your own terms. That's the only deal here. Naomi held his gaze, searching for deception, and apparently finding none. Finally, she nodded once and turned to the others, speaking rapidly in Apache. They responded in the same language, a conversation that Elias couldn't follow, but could read in body language skepticism, giving way to tentative acceptance. When they finished, Naomi turned back to him. We'll stay until the thaw. By then, Tala's foot should be healed enough to travel. We'll work for our keep, and we'll leave you enough supplies to replace what we used. Agreed? Agreed yet, Elias said, even though he had no intention of accepting payment. The days that followed established a rhythm that was both foreign and strangely comfortable to Elias. He woke at dawn, but now instead of solitary chores, he found himself part of a household. The women continued their industrious repairs by the end of the first week. His cabin had never been cleaner, his fences had never been sturdier, and his mending basket had been emptied for the first time since he'd built the place. But it wasn't just work. Slowly, cautiously, conversation began to replace silence. He learned that Kaya had the sharpest eyes he'd ever seen. She could spot a rabbit at 300 yards and read weather patterns in cloud formations with uncanny accuracy. She'd taken over checking his trap lines, and his catch rate had tripled. He learned that Ruth could cook things with wild plants that he'd never considered edible, transforming his basic supplies into meals that actually had flavor. She seemed to know every root berry and herb in the Colorado mountains, and she'd begun drying them for tea and medicine. He learned that Mara sang while she worked old Apache songs that he didn't understand, but that filled the air with something that felt like memory and mourning braided together. He learned that Tala, despite her youth and her pain, had an irrepressible curiosity. She asked questions constantly about his past, about the war, about why he lived alone, about the names of trees and animals, about everything. At first it annoyed him, then touched him, and finally made him realize how much he'd missed simple human conversation. And he learned that Naomi was the strongest person he'd ever met. She worked from dawn until dark, despite feet that must have ached constantly. She coordinated the others with quiet authority, making sure everyone had tasks that suited their abilities and didn't overtax their injuries. She checked their wounds each evening, redoing bandages with the supplies Elias provided, and she made sure everyone ate before she took her own portion. She also began teaching him Apache words, correcting his pronunciation with a patience that surprised him. "Shije'e," she said one afternoon while they were repairing a section of roof that had started leaking. "Father, say it." "Shije'e." Elias repeated, his tongue struggling with sounds English didn't use. "Better. Now Shima. Mother. Shima." "And this," she gestured to the sky. "Ya, sky. And this," she touched the pine branch in her hand. "Dishchi, pine." "Why are you teaching me?" Elias asked. Naomi was quiet for a moment, hammering in a nail before answering. "Because you asked our names. Because you use them. Because you treat us like people, not problems." She looked at him directly. "Because maybe if more men spoke our language, they'd have harder time forgetting we're human." It was the most she'd said about the massacre since that first morning, and Elias felt the weight of it settle in his chest alongside all the other weights he carried. "Naomi," he said carefully, "when you're ready to talk about what happened, all of it, I'll listen. And if you're never ready, that's fine too. But I want you to know that nothing you tell me will change the fact that you're welcome here." Naomi's hand stilled on the hammer. She stared at the roof for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded once and went back to work. That night, for the first time, she stayed after the others had gone to sleep in the woodshed. She sat at Elias's table while he poured coffee, and in the firelight with the wind howling outside, she told him the full story. She told him about Running Deer, who had been so proud to learn carpentry, who had built their lodge with his own hands, and wanted to build a school someday for Apache children. She told him about the winter before when the ranchers first came and warned them to leave, and how the agency man had said they had every right to stay. She told him about the night of the attack when drunken men with torches had ridden through their camp shooting at anything that moved. How James had stepped forward with his hands up, speaking English, trying to explain they had permission to be there. How the lead rancher had shot him in the chest and laughed while he fell. "I heard him laugh." Naomi said, her voice steady, but her hands clenched around her coffee cup. "That's what I remember most. Not the gunshot, not James falling. The laughter." Elias said nothing, just listened, his own coffee growing cold in his hands. She told him how they'd hidden in the creek bed while the camp burned, how they'd crawled out after the ranchers left and found 5 men dead and everything they owned destroyed. How they'd bandaged each other with torn pieces of clothing and started walking because staying meant freezing to death. "We saw 3 other homesteads before we found you," Naomi said. "The first one, the man saw us coming and fired a warning shot. The second one, the woman screamed and her husband threatened to set dogs on us. The third one, nobody answered, even though we could see them watching from the windows." She looked up at Elias, and he saw tears in her eyes for the first time, not falling just there, caught in her lashes like ice. "We were going to die," she said simply. "We knew it. Tala said maybe we should just stop walking, find somewhere peaceful, and let the cold take us. It would have been easier than more rejection. But I couldn't let them give up. I couldn't let those men win by killing our spirits after they'd already killed our husbands." "I'm glad you didn't stop," Elias said quietly. "So am I," Naomi whispered. "Now." They sat in silence for a long time after that, 2 people who had seen the worst of humanity and were trying to figure out if that meant there was no good left in the world or if it meant the good that remained was worth fighting for. Finally, Naomi stood. "Thank you," she said, "for listening, for not offering empty comfort, for just being honest." "You can tell me anything," Elias said. "Anytime." Naomi nodded, then paused at the door. "Elias, what you said about Washita River, about watching and doing nothing." She turned back to face him. "You're not that man anymore. I see that now." After she left, Elias sat alone in his cabin, staring into the fire and thinking about redemption, whether it was possible, whether it was deserved, whether 5 Apache widows and 1 guilt-ridden scout could build something that looked like forgiveness in a cabin in the Colorado mountains. The next morning brought the first real test of their fragile arrangement. Elias was in the goat pen with Sherman, who had developed a limp that needed checking when Kaya came running from the tree line where she'd been checking traps. "Ryder," she said breathlessly, "coming from the South Trail." Elias felt his blood go cold. "How far?" "Maybe 20 minutes. Single horse, moving slow." He straightened his mind, racing through possibilities. "Get everyone inside the woodshed. Bar the door. Don't come out until I give the all clear." Kaya nodded and ran. Within minutes, all 5 women had disappeared into the shed, and Elias heard the bar drop into place. He walked to his cabin, pulled down his Henry rifle, checked the load, and took up position on his porch, where he could see the trail from town. The rider appeared 15 minutes later, emerging from the tree line on a sorrel gelding. As he got closer, Elias recognized him. Deputy Frank Holloway from Wolf Hollow, a man in his mid-30s with a drooping mustache and eyes that never quite met yours straight on. Holloway reined in his horse at the gate, his hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip. "Morning, Monroe." "Deputy," Elias acknowledged, not moving from his position. "Long ride up here. Must be important." "Just checking on folks," Holloway said, his eyes scanning the property. "Making sure everyone survived the cold snap. His gaze lingered on the woodshed on the smoke rising from its chimney. Seems like you got company. My business, Elias said flatly. Sure. Holloway smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Though there's been some talk in town. Ranchers from the Taylor spread lost some mules last week. Been tracking them, and the trail led up this way before the snow covered it. I don't have any mules, as you can see. No, you don't. Holloway's horse shifted, sensing its rider's tension. But you got smoke coming from that shed, and I'm thinking maybe you know something about where those Indians went that survived the fire at the squatter camp. Elias's finger moved to rest near the trigger of his rifle. I don't know what you're talking about. The Taylor boys said there were 5 squaws that ran off, said they were heading this direction. Holloway leaned forward in his saddle. Now, if you were harboring them, that'd be a problem. Those women are wanted for questioning about the mules. That's horseshit, and you know it, Elias said coldly. The Taylor boys got drunk and shot up a legal camp, murdered 5 men, and you want to blame the survivors for stealing mules? Holloway's expression hardened. You calling me a liar, Monroe? I'm saying you're repeating lies that rich ranchers told you. There's a difference. For a long moment they stared at each other. Holloway's hand twitched toward his gun, then stopped. He might have been willing to arrest Apache women, but facing down a former Army scout with a rifle was different math. This ain't over, Holloway finally said. Sheriff's gonna want to hear about this. You tell the sheriff that if he's got questions, he can ride up here himself, Elias replied. And you tell those ranchers that anyone who comes onto my property looking for trouble will find it. Holloway's jaw clenched. He pulled his horse's head around and started back down the trail, but called over his shoulder, You're making a mistake, Monroe. Those people ain't worth protecting. Elias watched him disappear into the trees, his heart pounding. When the hoofbeats had faded completely, he called out, He's gone. The shed door opened slowly. Naomi emerged first, her face pale but composed. You shouldn't have done that. Now they know we're here. They already knew, Elias said, walking toward her, or suspected. And now they know I'm not going to hand you over. They'll come back, Mara said from the doorway. Maybe. Probably. Elias looked at each of them in turn. But Deputy Holloway came alone to fish for information. If he meant to arrest you or drag you back to town, he would have brought more men. This was a test. And you failed it, Ruth said quietly. In their eyes. Good, Elias said firmly. Let them know where I stand. Makes things clearer all around. That night, the mood in camp was tense. The women worked with one eye always on the trail, and Elias kept his rifle close. They all knew the fragile peace of the past week had been shattered. The outside world had found them, and it wouldn't forget. But something else had changed too. When Naomi brought Elias dinner that evening, Ruth had made a stew that actually tasted like something beyond survival. She sat with him instead of immediately returning to the shed. You put yourself at risk for us today, she said. I told you last night you're welcome here. I know what you told me, but words are easy. What you did today, standing up to that deputy, that wasn't easy. That could bring you real trouble. Elias shrugged. I've had trouble before. Not like this. Not when your neighbors will side against you. Not when the law looks the other way. Naomi set down her bowl. I know what men expect when they protect women, Elias. I need to know, is that what this is? Elias met her eyes. No. Then what is it? He thought about the question about all the complicated guilt and hope and loneliness that had led him to open his gate to 5 bleeding strangers. It's a chance to be the man I should have been 15 years ago. It's a chance to stand on the right side of something for once. And maybe, he paused, maybe it's a chance to remember what it feels like to be human instead of just surviving. Naomi was quiet for a long time. Then she reached across the space between them and touched his hand just briefly, just for a moment. Thank you, she said, for seeing us as people, for treating us like we matter, for not asking for anything in return. You matter, Elias said simply. All of you. And anyone who says different is going to have to answer to me. As Naomi walked back to the shed through the snow, Elias sat alone under the stars and realized that something fundamental had shifted in him. For 5 years, he'd been running from human connection, convinced that isolation was the only honest response to a world full of cruelty. But these 5 women had shown him something different. They had survived unspeakable violence, lost everything, and still woke up each morning ready to work to help to keep living. They had chosen hope when despair would have been easier. They had chosen to trust when trust had betrayed them before. And in doing so, they had given Elias Monroe a gift he hadn't known he needed: a reason to stop running, a reason to stand and fight, a reason to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world contained enough good to balance out the bad if you were willing to be part of that good instead of just mourning its absence. The wind that night was gentle, and inside the woodshed 5 women slept more soundly than they had in weeks, knowing that for the first time since their world had burned, someone was standing watch who wouldn't let them fall. The days after Deputy Holloway's visit transformed the mountain homestead into something that felt almost like vigilance wrapped in routine. Elias found himself checking the tree line more often, his hand never far from his rifle, while the women worked with a new wariness that showed in the way they paused mid-task to scan the horizon. Yet somehow, through the tension, something else was growing. Something neither Elias nor Naomi had words for yet, but both felt in the quiet moments when their eyes met across the yard or their hands brushed while passing tools. It was Tala who first noticed the change, whispering to Kaya and Apache while they gathered eggs from the 3 hens Elias kept. Kaya had smiled knowingly and replied in the same language, and when Naomi shot them both a warning look, they'd gone silent but continued smiling. Even Ruth, the quietest of the 5, had started humming while she cooked, and Mara's songs had taken on a less mournful tone. The healing was visible in more than just spirits. Tala's foot, which Elias had feared might be permanently damaged, was responding to Ruth's poultices of yarrow and comfrey. The deep lacerations were closing cleanly, and though the girl still limped, she could now walk without leaving bloody prints in the snow. The frostbite on several of their toes had receded without turning necrotic, which Elias attributed to Ruth's knowledge of mountain plants and to getting them warm when he did. Naomi's face wound had healed into a scar that ran like a silver thread from cheekbone to jaw. She never tried to hide it, wearing it instead like a medal of survival. More than once, Elias caught himself staring at her profile in the firelight, thinking that the scar somehow made her more beautiful, not less a visible reminder of strength that refused to break. 3 weeks had passed since that first night when Naomi stayed in the cabin to help Elias repair a broken chair leg. The work had taken longer than necessary because they kept pausing to talk about nothing important about everything important. She told him about growing up in Arizona Territory, about learning to track deer with her father, about the first time she'd seen snow and thought the world was ending in white. He told her about Pennsylvania, about a childhood spent in coal country, about leaving at 16 to escape a father who drank, and a future that looked like darkness underground. "Is that why you joined the army?" Naomi asked, holding the chair steady while Elias applied glue to the joint. "Seemed like adventure at the time," Elias said. "Seemed like seeing the world was better than dying in a mine shaft." "And was it better?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, tightening the rope tourniquet that held the glue joint closed. "I saw the world, but I also saw what men do to each other when they decide some lives matter less than others. So no, I don't think it was better, just different." Naomi's hand had covered his, then stopping his work. "You're not those men, Elias. How do you know?" "Because those men wouldn't have opened their gate. Those men wouldn't lose sleep worrying about a girl's frostbitten foot. Those men wouldn't sit up late teaching themselves Apache words because they want to speak to us in our own language." She paused. "Those men wouldn't look at me the way you do." Elias had frozen, his heart suddenly loud in his chest. "How do I look at you?" "Like I'm a person," Naomi said softly. "Like my scars don't make me broken. Like maybe—" She'd trailed off, seeming to struggle with words. "Like maybe there's something here worth building toward." They hadn't spoken more that night, but something had been acknowledged. A door opened that neither was quite ready to walk through yet, but that both knew was there now waiting. The next morning brought work as usual, but the quality of silence had changed between them. When Elias brought wood for the shed stove, Naomi's thank you lingered half a second longer than necessary. When she handed him coffee at breakfast, their fingers touched and neither pulled away immediately. The other women noticed exchanging glances that ranged from knowing to worried to hopeful, but no one said anything directly. It was during the fourth week that the weather shifted ominously. The temperature began to drop again, and Kaya, reading the sky with her uncanny accuracy, announced that a major storm was coming, the kind that could bury the mountain under 3 feet of snow and trap them for a week or more. Elias immediately began preparations. He hauled extra firewood to both the cabin and the shed, stacking it high under cover. He brought in additional water, filling every barrel and bucket he owned. He moved half his root cellar supplies to the shed so the women wouldn't have to venture out during the worst of it. He checked and double-checked that the goats had adequate shelter and feed. Naomi worked alongside him, matching his urgency with her own. "How long do these storms usually last?" she asked, while they were reinforcing the goat shelter with extra pine boughs. 3 to 7 days depending. The snow comes fast and heavy, then the wind piles it into drifts that can bury a building. Last year I couldn't open my cabin door for 2 days, had to dig out through a window. "And you survived that alone?" "I was prepared," Elias said, hammering in another support beam. "Had everything I needed inside before it hit." Naomi was quiet for a moment, then said carefully, "When this storm comes, you should stay in the cabin. We'll be fine in the shed." Elias looked at her, catching something underneath her words. "You think someone might come during the storm?" "I think Deputy Holloway's visit was a warning. I think the ranchers are waiting for the right moment. And I think a major snowstorm, when no one can see what happens on this mountain, might be exactly the moment they've been waiting for." The fear in her voice was controlled but real, and Elias felt anger kindle in his chest, not at her, but at a world where people who'd already lost everything had to stay afraid. "Nobody's coming for you while I'm breathing," he said firmly. "Storm or no storm, anyone who rides up here looking for trouble will find me first." "That's what I'm afraid of," Naomi said quietly. "That you'll get hurt protecting us. That will cost you more than shelter and supplies. That will cost you your life." Elias set down his hammer and turned to face her fully. The afternoon sun caught in her dark hair, and her eyes, which had been so guarded that first night, now held a warmth that made his breath catch. "Some things are worth the cost," he said. Naomi stepped closer, near enough that he could see the pulse beating in her throat, could smell the pinewood smoke that clung to her clothes. "Am I one of those things?" It was the most direct either of them had been about what was growing between them, and Elias felt the weight of the moment settle around them like new snow. "Yes," he said simply. "You are." Naomi's eyes searched his face, looking for deception or qualification, and finding neither. Then she did something that surprised them both. She reached up and touched his cheek, her palm warm against his cold skin. "I didn't think I'd ever trust a man again," she said. "Didn't think I'd ever want to. But you make me want to try." Elias covered her hand with his own, holding it against his face. "I don't deserve that trust, but I'll do everything I can to earn it." They stood like that for a long moment, two people who'd survived different kinds of war, finding unexpected peace in each other's presence. Then Tala's voice called from the cabin she'd been watching the trail, and the spell broke. "Someone's coming." Elias and Naomi ran toward the cabin, arriving just as Tala pointed toward the southern trail. Through the trees, barely visible in the fading light, a rider was approaching. Just one like before, but moving with more purpose than Holloway had shown. "Everyone inside the shed," Elias ordered, already moving toward his rifle. "Now!" But Naomi caught his arm. "Wait. Look at the horse." Elias squinted at the approaching figure and felt his stomach drop. It wasn't Deputy Holloway's sorrel, it was a gray mare, and the rider was slumped forward in the saddle like someone barely holding on. As they watched, the rider swayed dangerously, and the horse, sensing no guidance, slowed to a walk, then stopped entirely about 50 yards from the gate. The figure slid sideways, caught themselves on the saddle horn, then slowly, almost gracefully, toppled into the snow. "Could be a trick," Kaya said from the doorway, her voice tense. "Or someone in trouble," Ruth countered. Elias grabbed his rifle and approached, carefully keeping the barrel pointed at the fallen figure. As he got closer, details emerged. The rider was young, maybe 20, wearing a deputy's badge, but dressed too thin for the temperature. His face was pale as the snow he'd fallen into, and when Elias knelt beside him, he could see blood seeping through the man's coat from a wound in his side. He's been shot, Elias called back. Help me get him inside. Naomi and Kaya came immediately, though Mara held Tala back with a hand on her shoulder. The youngest didn't need to see more violence. Together they hauled the unconscious deputy into Elias's cabin and laid him on the rope bed. Ruth was already heating water and gathering her medicine supplies. Why are we helping him? Mara asked, her voice sharp with old anger. He wears the same badge as the man who threatened us. Because he's dying, Elias said, simply cutting away the deputy's coat and shirt. And because we're better than the people who hurt us. The wound was bad. A bullet had entered just below his ribs on the left side and hadn't exited. The deputy's breathing was shallow and rapid, his skin clammy with shock. Elias had seen enough battlefield injuries to know this man wouldn't survive the night without help. I need to get the bullet out, he said, looking at Ruth. Do you have anything for pain? Ruth produced a leather pouch containing dried leaves. Willow bark and valerian root. Won't knock him out, but it'll dull the worst of it. Make tea strong as possible. While Ruth brewed the medicine, Naomi cleaned the wound with carbolic acid. The deputy groaned but didn't wake. His lips had taken on a blue tinge that Elias didn't like. Who do you think shot him? Kaya asked quietly. Don't know yet, Elias said, threading a needle with steady hands. But we're going to find out. When Ruth's tea was ready, they managed to get some down the deputy's throat. Then Elias began the delicate work of probing for the bullet. It took 20 minutes of careful digging with Naomi holding the lantern steady and Ruth pressing claws to soak up blood before his forceps finally caught metal. The bullet came out misshapen but intact, and Elias quickly sutured the wound closed. His hands, remembering field surgery skills he'd hoped never to use again. Throughout the procedure, the deputy drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling words they couldn't quite make out. Once he clearly said, Taylor, and Naomi's hands tightened on the lantern. Another time he said, didn't know, followed by something that sounded like an apology. When Elias had finished and bandaged the wound, he washed his hands and stood back studying his work. He's got a chance now, but he'll be down for days, maybe a week. And if infection sets in, then we fight it, Naomi said firmly. Same as we did for Tala's foot. Elias looked at her, surprised. You want to save him after everything? I want to be able to look at myself in the mirror, Naomi replied. I want to know that we're not like them, that when someone needs help, we give it badge or no badge. She paused. Besides, he might know things. Might tell us what we're really facing. It was strategic thinking wrapped in compassion, and Elias found himself admiring her even more for it. All right, but we take turns watching him. Nobody stays alone with him until we know whether he's friend or enemy. That night, while the wind began to howl with the leading edge of the promised storm, they established a watch rotation. Ruth took first shift sitting by the bed with her medicine bag and a knife within reach. The others returned to the shed except for Naomi, who lingered at the door. Elias, she said quietly, what you said earlier, about some things being worth the cost. I meant it. I know you did. That's what scares me. She wrapped her arms around herself, and Elias realized she was trembling, not from cold, but from emotion held too long in check. Every person I've cared about has been taken from me. My parents died of fever when I was 12. James was shot in front of me 3 weeks ago. I'm terrified that if I let myself care about you, the universe will find a way to take you too. Elias crossed the space between them, and after a moment's hesitation, where he gave her time to step back, pulled her into an embrace. She stiffened initially, then slowly, carefully allowed herself to lean into him, her forehead resting against his chest. I can't promise nothing will happen to me, he said into her hair. This is a dangerous world and we're in a dangerous situation. But I can promise that whatever happens, I'll do everything I can to stay alive. For you, for all of you. Naomi's arms came up around his waist, holding him with surprising strength. They stood like that for a long time, two people who'd forgotten what it felt like to be held, remembering together. When they finally separated, Naomi's eyes were bright with unshed tears. When this is over, if we survive whatever's coming, ask me again. Ask you what was... You know what? She smiled a real smile that transformed her scarred face into something radiant. But ask me when we're not surrounded by violence and fear. Ask me when we have a chance at an actual future. I will, Elias promised. The storm hit hard just before midnight, announced by a wind that sounded like artillery fire and snow that came down so thick it was impossible to see 5 feet beyond the windows. Elias added wood to both Fire's cabin and shed and settled into his chair to begin his watch shift over the wounded deputy. The young man woke briefly around 2 a.m, his eyes unfocused with fever and pain. Elias gave him water and more of Ruth's medicine, and the deputy grasped his wrist with surprising strength. "The Taylor brothers, Yek," he gasped. "They're coming. Holloway told them about the women. They're planning—" He broke off coughing. "Easy," Elias said. "Save your strength." "No, you need to know." The deputy's eyes were clear now, focused with the desperate clarity of someone who knows they might not get another chance to speak. "My name's Jacob Reeves. I'm new to Wolf Hollow, only been deputy for 3 months. When Holloway came back from here and told the Taylors there were Apache women on your land, they laughed, said they'd finish what they started." "How did you get shot?" Jacob's face twisted with shame. "I told them I wouldn't be part of another massacre. That what they did to that camp was murder, not justice. Bill Taylor, the oldest brother, called me a coward. I said I'd report them to the territorial marshal. He shot me before I could draw my gun. Left me for dead in the snow." Elias felt cold rage settle in his stomach. How many of them? 4 Taylor brothers. Plus Holloway makes 5. Maybe more. They've been recruiting at the saloon, offering whiskey to anyone willing to clear out the Indian problem. Jacob coughed again, and blood flecked his lips. "I thought I could make it to warn you. Didn't know if I'd live long enough." "When are they coming?" "Was supposed to be tonight, but the storm—" Jacob looked toward the window where snow was piling against the glass. "Might buy you a day or 2. Once it clears, though." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Elias stood and walked to the window, staring out at the white chaos beyond. A part of him had known this was coming, known from the moment Deputy Holloway rode away that peaceful coexistence wasn't possible. Men like the Taylors didn't leave loose ends. They didn't tolerate anyone who challenged their authority or questioned their right to violence. Behind him, Jacob spoke again, his voice weaker now. "I'm sorry. I should have done more. Should have stood up to them sooner." "You did what you could?" Elias said, turning back. "And you rode through a storm with a bullet in your gut to warn us. That takes courage." "Or stupidity." Jacob tried to smile, but winced instead. "Either way, you need to be ready. Bill Taylor fought in the war Confederate cavalry. He's mean and he's smart. His brothers are just mean, but that makes them dangerous in different ways. And Holloway?" Jacob's expression darkened. "Holloway owes the Taylors money. He'll do whatever they say to clear his debt." As dawn broke gray and storm-filled, Elias woke the others and told them what Jacob had revealed. The mood in the small cabin was grim, but nobody suggested running. They'd already learned that running just meant dying tired. Instead, they planned. Elias had 5 rifles, including Jacob's deputy carbine. He distributed them to those who knew how to shoot himself, Naomi, and Kaya, whose eyes were sharp enough to pick targets at distance. He showed Ruth and Mara how to reload, making them practice until their hands moved automatically. Tala, still healing, was assigned to watch Jacob and keep him medicated and alive. They might need his testimony later if they survived. The cabin became a fortress. Elias reinforced the door with cross-bracing and pushed his heavy table against it as a secondary barrier. He created firing positions at each window with extra ammunition stacked within reach. He filled every container with snow to melt for water in case they got trapped inside. He moved his most valuable supplies, the salt, the coffee, the ammunition, into a hidden cache under the floor. Through it all, the storm raged, dumping snow that piled higher and higher against the walls. Sherman and the goats huddled in their shelter, safe for now, but increasingly buried. The world contracted to just what they could see from the cabin windows, which was essentially nothing but white fury. On the second day of the storm, while Elias and Naomi were reinforcing the window shutters, she suddenly stopped working and turned to him. "I need to tell you something," she said, "in case we don't make it through this." "We'll make it. Maybe. But I need to say it anyway." She took a breath. "That first night when we came to your gate, I expected you to turn us away. Part of me wanted you to, because then I could hate all white men equally and the world would make sense. But you didn't. You opened that gate, And you've been opening doors ever since, treating us like family, standing up to the law for us, preparing to fight for us." Her voice grew thick with emotion. "You gave me back something I thought was gone forever. Hope. And more than that," she paused, seemed to gather courage. "More than that, you made me want to live instead of just survive. You made me think maybe there's a future worth having." Elias set down his hammer and took her hands in his. They were rough from work, scarred from old injuries, strong and capable. Beautiful. "When this is over," he said, "I'm going to marry you. If you'll have me, I'm going to write your name in every legal document that matters, give you half of everything I own, and spend whatever years I have left making sure you never doubt that you're loved." Naomi's eyes widened. "Elias, I know it's crazy. I know we've only known each other a month. I know there's 1,000 practical reasons to wait." He held her gaze steadily. "But I also know that life is short and uncertain, and I've wasted too many years already being afraid of connection. So yes, I'm saying it now before the fight because I want you to have something to fight for beyond just survival." "I love you too," Naomi whispered. And then she was kissing him, her lips warm, despite the cold, her hands tangling in his hair. Elias pulled her closer. Tasting salt from tears he wasn't sure were hers or his, or both feeling something break open in his chest that had been locked away for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, Naomi laughed, a sound of pure joy that seemed impossible given their circumstances. "When this is over," she said, "I'm going to say yes, but you're right. Ask me again when we're not about to fight for our lives. Ask me when there's a future to plan for." "Deal," Elias said, and kissed her again. The storm broke on the morning of the third day, leaving behind a world buried under 3 feet of fresh snow and a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The silence after days of howling wind was almost unnerving. Elias stood on his porch surveying the damage drifts had piled against the cabin. To window height, the path to the shed was completely buried, and the goat pen was visible only as a snow-covered mound. But everyone was alive the structures had held, and they had maybe a day before the trails became passable enough for the Taylors to ride in. "We dig out today," Elias announced. "Create firing positions in the snow. Build berms we can shoot from cover. Turn this homestead into a killing ground for anyone stupid enough to attack." They worked like demons, all of them, even Tala doing what she could with her healing foot. They shoveled paths between buildings, then used the snow to build defensive walls with firing slits. They positioned spare rifles at strategic points so they could move between positions if needed. They filled buckets with snow and staged them near the cabin in case fire became a threat. Jacob, feverish but conscious, watched from the bed and offered tactical advice from his brief military experience. "Create overlapping fields of fire. Make sure every approach is covered. And for God's sake, don't let them get close. If they breach the cabin, you're done." As sunset painted the snow orange and gold, Elias climbed onto his roof and scanned the horizon with his spyglass. Nothing moved in the vast white wilderness, but he knew it was the calm before violence, the held breath before the scream. That night, nobody slept in the shed. All 5 women crowded into the cabin with Elias and Jacob weapons within reach, coffee keeping them alert. They took turns at the windows, watching the tree line for movement that never came. But as dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of pearl and rose, Kaya, whose eyes missed nothing, spotted them first. "Riders," she said calmly, pointing toward the southern trail. 6 of them, moving slow through the snow. Elias felt his heart rate slow, felt the old combat calm settle over him like a familiar coat. This was it. This was the moment everything had been building toward. He checked his Henry rifle one last time, then looked at the people gathered in his cabin, 5 Apache women who'd survived massacre, and a wounded deputy who'd chosen honor over safety, and 1 former Army scout who'd finally found something worth fighting for. "Remember," he said quietly, "we're not murderers. We only shoot if they force us to. But if they do," his jaw tightened, "if they do, we end this today, one way or another." The riders came on through the snow, 6 dark shapes against the white morning death, approaching slowly but inevitably like winter itself. And in the cabin, 7 people waited, weapons ready, hearts pounding, preparing to defend the fragile home they'd built together, against men who believed some lives mattered less than others. The war had come to the mountain, and Elias Monroe was done running. The 6 riders stopped at the tree line just beyond rifle range, their horses stamping and blowing clouds of steam into the frozen morning air. They sat there for a long moment, studying the cabin and the defensive positions that Elias and the women had built into the snow. Even from a distance, Elias could read the calculation in their pause. They'd expected an easy target, not a fortified position manned by people ready to fight. "They're talking," Kaya said from her window position, her sharp eyes tracking the gestures and movements. "The one in front, big man on the black horse, he's angry, pointing at the cabin. The others keep looking at the snow berms we built." Elias pressed his eye to the spyglass, bringing the lead rider into focus. Bill Taylor was exactly as he'd imagined from Jacob's description, a bull of a man with a thick beard and eyes that held the particular cruelty of someone who'd learned to enjoy violence during the war and never stopped. His 3 brothers ranged around him like hunting dogs waiting for the command to attack. Deputy Holloway sat his horse slightly apart from the group, and even at this distance, Elias could see the tension in his posture. The 6th rider was unfamiliar, a lean man with a rifle across his saddle and the weathered face of someone who killed for money rather than principle. A hired gun, Elias realized, which meant the Taylors were taking this seriously enough to spend cash on professional violence. "What are they waiting for?" Mara whispered from her position near the door. "Trying to decide if we're worth the cost," Elias replied, not taking his eye from the glass. "They came expecting to massacre unarmed women. Now they're looking at a defensive position and trying to figure out how many of them will die if they attack." As if in answer to his words, Bill Taylor suddenly spurred his horse forward, riding to within shouting distance, but still carefully out of rifle range. He was smarter than Elias had hoped. "Monroe," Taylor's voice carried clearly across the snow, "we don't have quarrel with you. We're here for the Indians that murdered our property and stole our livestock. Send them out, and we'll leave peaceful." Elias moved to the door, opening it just wide enough to be seen, but keeping most of his body behind cover. "The only murderers here are you and your brothers Taylor. Those women came to me half dead from wounds you gave them. You want them, you're going to have to come through me." Taylor's face darkened even from that distance. "You're harboring criminals that makes you complicit in their crimes." "The only crime here is what you did to their camp," Elias shouted back. "You murdered 5 unarmed men and burned their homes. Your deputy here can testify to that." He gestured toward where Jacob lay on the bed, visible through the open door. There was a moment of confused silence. Then Holloway urged his horse forward, his face pale. "Jacob's alive. Alive and talking." Elias confirmed. "Told us everything. How you told the Taylors about the women. How Jacob said he'd report you to the territorial marshal. How Bill Taylor shot him and left him for dead." "That about cover it, deputy." Jacob's weak voice carried from inside the cabin. "That's right, Frank. I'm still breathing, and I remember everything. When this is done, you're going to hang alongside them." The effect on the riders was immediate and visible. The hired gun shifted uneasily in his saddle. 2 of the Taylor brothers exchanged worried glances. Holloway looked like he might be sick. Only Bill Taylor seemed unconcerned, though his hand had dropped to the revolver at his hip. "That boy's delirious with fever," Taylor called out, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Probably doesn't know what he's saying." "He knows exactly what he's saying," Elias replied. "And when the territorial marshal comes through here, and Jacob's testimony will put all of you in front of a judge. You can ride away now and take your chances with the law, or you can try to silence him and add more murders to your list. Your choice." It was a bluff, but a calculated one. The territorial marshal rarely came to Wolf Hollow, and when he did, he tended to side with wealthy ranchers over Apache widows. But these men didn't know that Elias knew that. They had to weigh the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the law might actually work this time. Bill Taylor sat his horse in silence for a long moment, and Elias could almost see the wheels turning behind those cruel eyes. Then Taylor smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd made a decision that pleased him. "You've got until sundown," Taylor called. "Send out the Indians by then, and we'll let you and the deputy live. Otherwise, we come in after dark and burn you out. You'll all die screaming in the flames, and nobody will ever know what happened up here. Storm will have covered our tracks by tomorrow." Without waiting for a response, Taylor wheeled his horse and rode back to the tree line. The others followed, and within minutes they disappeared into the forest, leaving only hoofprints in the snow to prove they'd been there at all. Elias closed the door and leaned against it, his heart pounding despite his outward calm. Naomi appeared at his side immediately, her hand finding his. "That bought us maybe 12 hours, she said quietly. 12 hours we didn't have before," Elias replied. 12 hours to prepare to rest, to figure out how we're going to survive the night. "We could run," Ruth suggested from her position by the fire. "Take the horses and try to make it to Canyon Post before they come back." "We'd never make it," Kaya said flatly. "Not through 3 feet of snow with Tala's foot still healing and Jacob barely able to sit up. They'd track us down before we got 5 miles and we'd die in the open instead of behind walls." "Then we stay and fight," Mara said, her voice carrying the anger she'd been holding since that first night. "We make them pay for what they did." "We stay and fight," Elias agreed. "But smart. Jacob, you said Bill Taylor was cavalry. What else do we need to know?" Jacob had managed to prop himself up on one elbow, his face drawn with pain but his eyes alert. "He likes fire. Used it during the war to flush out resistance. That threat about burning you out wasn't just talk, it's his preferred tactic." He paused to catch his breath. "But fire needs to get close to work. If you can keep them at distance, keep them from reaching the cabin with torches, you've got a chance." "The snow helps," Elias said, thinking out loud. "Hard to set a wet log cabin on fire, even with kerosene. But they'll try for the roof, or the shed, or the goat pen, anywhere that'll create enough smoke and chaos to flush us out." "So we don't let them get close," Naomi said firmly. "We establish a perimeter, and anyone who crosses it gets shot. No warnings, no second chances." Elias looked at her, seeing the steel that had kept her walking through snow with bare feet, the strength that had survived massacre, and kept 4 other women alive through sheer force of will. "You understand what that means. These aren't strangers in a war somewhere else. These are neighbors. Men from town. Killing them will have consequences if we survive." "James was a neighbor too," Naomi replied, her voice hard. "He fixed the church roof. He helped Old Man Henderson rebuild his barn after the fire. He was part of that town." Her hand tightened on Elias's. "And they shot him for sport while he begged for his life. So yes, I understand what it means. And I'll live with those consequences if it means protecting the people I love." The words hung in the air, the people I love, and Elias realized she wasn't just talking about the other Apache women anymore. She was talking about him, about the family they'd built in the space of a month, the home they'd created out of necessity, and transformed into something worth dying to protect. "All right then," Elias said, straightening up. "We've got 12 hours. Let's use them." They spent the morning preparing with grim efficiency. Elias distributed his remaining ammunition, making sure everyone knew exactly how many shots they had, and making each one count. Ruth prepared food that could be eaten cold. They wouldn't have time for cooking once the fighting started. Mara filled containers with snow to melt for water and for dousing any fires that might start. Tala, despite her foot, insisted on helping Jacob reload spare rifles, her young hands moving with surprising dexterity. Kaya took position on the roof where her exceptional eyesight could spot approaching threats earliest. Elias had been reluctant to put her in such an exposed position, but she'd insisted, and he'd learned over the past weeks that arguing with these women was generally a losing proposition. As midday approached, Naomi found Elias in the root cellar where he was organizing their last supplies of food in case they got trapped inside for days. She descended the ladder carefully, and in the dim light filtering through the hatch, her scarred face looked both fierce and beautiful. "If we don't make it through this," she said without preamble, "I want you to know that this past month has been the happiest of my life, despite everything, because of you." Elias set down the sack of potatoes he'd been moving and crossed to her, taking her face gently in his hands. "We're going to make it, all of us, and then I'm going to marry you properly with witnesses and vows and everything you deserve." "I don't need properly," Naomi said, covering his hands with hers. "I just need you." "But Elias," her voice caught, "if something happens to me, promise you'll take care of the others. Promise you'll make sure Tala gets somewhere safe, that Kaya and Mara and Ruth have a future. Promise me they won't die up here forgotten." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Elias said fiercely. "I won't let it." You can't control everything no matter how much you want to. Naomi smiled sadly. Just promise me, please. I promise, Elias said through the words felt like knives. But you're going to be there to see it yourself. You're going to watch Tala grow up. You're going to teach Kaya to read English. You're going to listen to Mara's songs and eat Ruth's cooking and grow old annoying me with how stubborn you are. Naomi laughed, then a sound of pure affection that made Elias's heart ache. I'm stubborn. That's rich coming from a man who built a cabin 15 miles from civilization because he didn't want to deal with people. I had good reasons. You had scared reasons, Naomi corrected gently. But you're not that scared man anymore. You know that, right? You faced your fear when you opened that gate. Everything since then has just been you becoming who you were always meant to be. Before Elias could respond, Kaya's voice rang out from the roof, sharp with urgency. Movement Eastern Trail this time, 3 riders. They scrambled up the ladder and out of the cabin. Elias grabbed his spyglass and scanned the direction Kaya had indicated. 3 riders were indeed approaching, but these weren't dressed like ranchers or lawmen. They wore heavy coats and fur hats, and one of them was leading a pack mule laden with supplies. I don't recognize them, Elias said, confused. Jacob, can you see from there? Jacob had dragged himself to the window, his face slick with sweat from the effort. He squinted at the approaching riders, then his expression cleared. That's Dr. Chen from Canyon Post. The woman with him is his wife. She's a midwife. Don't know the 3rd rider. As the riders got closer, Elias could make out more details. The lead rider was indeed an older Chinese man with a medical bag strapped to his saddle. The woman beside him rode with easy competence, and the 3rd rider, a young white man barely out of his teens, kept glancing nervously at the forest around them. They stopped at the gate, and Dr. Chen called out in accented English, Mr. Monroe, we are friends. Jacob Reeves's brother sent us. May we approach? Elias exchanged glances with Naomi, then called back, Come ahead slowly. Hands where I can see them. The 3 riders dismounted and led their horses through the gate. Up close, Dr. Chen was perhaps 60, with kind eyes and steady hands. His wife, who introduced herself as Mei Chen, was younger and had the no-nonsense bearing of someone who'd seen every kind of medical crisis and survived them all. The young man was Tommy Reeves, Jacob's younger brother, and he was so relieved to hear Jacob was alive that he nearly collapsed in the snow. How did you know to come here? Elias asked, still wary despite their friendly appearance. Jacob told Tommy about coming to warn you, Dr. Chen explained. When Jacob didn't return and the storm hit, Tommy grew worried. He came to Canyon Post looking for help. I have been treating the Apache people there for many years. I know what the Taylor brothers are capable of. His expression hardened. They are not good men. When Tommy said they were planning to attack this homestead, I could not sit idle. You rode through a blizzard and potentially into a gunfight to help people you don't know, Elias said, incredulous. Mei Chen spoke for the first time, her English crisp and precise. We have lived in this territory for 15 years. We know what it is to be hated for how we look, to be blamed for crimes we didn't commit. The Apache people have been good to us when others were not. She gestured to the women watching from the cabin. If they need medical care or protection, we offer both. Inside the cabin, Dr. Chen immediately went to work on Jacob, checking his wound with expert hands and tutting over Elias's field surgery. Not bad for army medicine, he said, which Elias took as high praise. But infection has started. Without treatment, he dies in 3 days. With treatment, he pulled bottles and packets from his medical bag. He lives to testify against those who shot him. While Dr. Chen tended to Jacob, Mei Chen examined the women reapplying bandages to Tala's foot with a poultice that made the girl gasp at its cooling sensation. She checked Naomi's face wound, nodded approval at how cleanly it had healed, and provided Ruth with several packets of herbs and instructions for their use. Tommy Reeves, meanwhile, had broken down in tears at his brother's bedside, apologizing for not believing Jacob's warnings about the Taylors sooner. Jacob, despite his weakness, gripped Tommy's hand and told him that being here now was what mattered. As afternoon faded toward evening, Elias called a council around his table. 9 people crowded into the small cabin, 7 who'd been preparing to fight for their lives, and 2 who'd ridden into danger to offer help. The contrast wasn't lost on anyone. "The Taylors will come after dark," Elias said without preamble. "Maybe 6 men, maybe more if they recruited additional help in town. They'll try to burn us out or rush the cabin under cover of darkness. We've got good defensive positions, enough ammunition, and people who know how to shoot, but we're still outnumbered, and they've got nothing to lose." "They have everything to lose," Dr. Chen corrected quietly. "Jacob's testimony will ruin them, destroy their reputation, their business, possibly put them in prison. That makes them desperate, and desperate men do foolish things. We can use that." "How?" Naomi asked. Dr. Chen smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd survived by being smarter than his enemies. "They expect you to wait here like trapped animals. They expect fear and panic. What if instead we take the fight to them?" Over the next hour, they crafted a plan that was equal parts desperate and brilliant. They would use the defensive positions to create the illusion that everyone was hunkered down in the cabin. But in reality, Elias, Naomi, and Kaya, the 3 best shots, would circle around through the forest and position themselves behind where the Taylors would likely stage their attack. When the ranchers moved forward to assault the cabin, they'd be caught in a crossfire between the cabin's defenders and the shooters in the woods. It was risky. The 3 would be exposed in the forest with limited backup, but it also gave them the element of surprise, and surprise could be worth more than superior numbers. "I'll go too," Tommy Reeves said, his jaw set with determination. "I'm not much of a shot, but I can reload, and I can carry ammunition. Jacob's my brother. I won't hide while others fight to protect him." Machen insisted on remaining in the cabin to provide medical care for anyone wounded, which meant her husband wouldn't leave her side. That left Ruth, Mara, and Tala to hold the cabin defensive positions, along with the 2 Chinese doctors, and Jacob, who promised he could at least shoot from the window, even if he couldn't stand. As sunset painted the snow in shades of blood orange and purple, Elias gathered the assault team for final preparations. He showed them the trails through the forest, the positions they'd take, the signals they'd use to coordinate fire. Naomi listened intently, her rifle held with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd learned to shoot as a child. Kaya's eyes never stopped moving, reading the terrain the way other people read books. Before they left, Elias pulled Naomi aside one more time. The light was fading fast, and her face in the twilight looked like something from a dream or a memory of better times. "When this is over," he said quietly, "I'm going to build you a proper house. Not a cabin, a house with real windows and a floor that doesn't creak and enough rooms for everyone to have privacy. I'm going to plant an orchard and build a schoolhouse for Tala. I'm going to ride into Wolf Hollow and register all of you as legal residents under my protection, and I'm going to dare anyone to challenge it." "When this is over," Naomi replied, "I'm going to say yes to your proposal. I'm going to wear the blue dress that Ruth is going to make me, and I'm going to stand with you under the sky and promise to love you until the day I die. And then," her voice grew stronger, "and then we're going to live, Elias. Not just survive, live." They kissed then long and deep, tasting hope and fear and stubborn determination. When they separated, both had tears in their eyes, but both were smiling. The assault team moved into position as full darkness fell. The forest was alive with night sounds, wind in the pines, the distant call of an owl, the creak of frozen branches. They found a thick stand of spruce trees that offered both cover and a clear line of sight to the cabin, and they settled in to wait. They didn't wait long. Just after midnight, when the cold was at its deepest and most people would be in their heaviest sleep, the attack came. 7 riders. This time, the Taylors had found additional recruits willing to participate in massacre for the promise of money or land or whatever lies Bill Taylor had told them. They approached from the south, moving slowly through the snow, carrying torches that bobbed like fireflies in the darkness. From his hidden position, Elias could see their plan clearly. 4 men would rush the cabin with torches, while the other 3 provided covering fire. It was simple, brutal, and would have worked if everyone had been inside the cabin as expected. Instead, when the riders were within 50 yards of the cabin and committed to their attack, Elias gave the signal, 3 sharp whistles that carried clearly through the frozen air. The cabin defenders opened fire, first muzzle flashes lighting up the windows like lightning. The attackers caught in the open scattered immediately, some diving for cover behind snow berms, while others tried to wheel their horses back toward the forest. Then Elias, Naomi, Kaya, and Tommy opened fire from behind them, and the night exploded into chaos. The crossfire was devastating. 2 riders went down immediately, one screaming as he fell from his horse, the other silent and ominously still. The remaining 5 tried to return fire, but they were caught between 2 positions with nowhere to hide. Another went down clutching his leg, his screams piercing the night. Bill Taylor, to his credit, didn't panic. He bellowed orders, trying to rally his men toward the forest and cover. But Holloway's nerve broke. He spurred his horse and ran, disappearing into the darkness without firing a single shot. 2 others followed him, leaving only Bill and one brother to face the consequences of their violence. The Taylor brother Elias thought it might be the youngest. Pete made it almost to the tree line before Kaya's rifle cracked, and he tumbled from his saddle, landing face first in the snow and not moving. Bill Taylor, finding himself suddenly alone and surrounded, did the only thing left to him. He charged the cabin on horseback, torch in one hand and revolver in the other, screaming curses and defiance into the night. He made it 10 yards before 3 rifles fired as one, and Bill Taylor fell from his horse like a puppet with cut strings. He hit the snow hard, the torch flying from his hand and sputtering out in the wet snow. His horse continued running, disappearing into the forest, leaving its rider behind. The silence after the gunfire was profound, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the harsh breathing of people who'd just fought for their lives. Elias signaled for the assault team to hold position while he carefully approached the fallen riders, rifle at the ready. Bill Taylor was dead, shot through the chest and neck. Pete Taylor was also dead, killed by Kaya's shot to his spine. The man who'd gone down silently first turned out to be the hired gun. He'd taken a bullet to the head and never known what killed him. The 4th man, shot in the leg, was alive and crying, begging for help, and promising to tell everything if they just didn't kill him. As dawn broke cold and clear, the full scope of what they'd done settled over the homestead like new snow. 3 men dead, 1 wounded, and 3 fled into the night. It would have consequences, legal, social, practical. But everyone who'd fought was alive, and that was what mattered. Dr. Chen treated the wounded attacker with professional detachment, stopping the bleeding and stabilizing him for transport to the territorial marshal. The man talked without much prompting, confirming everything Jacob had testified and adding new details about the Taylors' previous crimes. He'd lived to face trial, and his testimony, combined with Jacob's, would ensure that Holloway and the surviving Taylor brothers faced justice. As morning light painted the snow in shades of gold, Elias found Naomi standing by the goat pen, watching Sherman butt his head against the gate in his eternal quest for freedom and extra feed. She leaned against Elias when he joined her, and they stood in silence for a long moment. "We did it," she said finally. "We survived." "We did more than survive," Elias replied, putting his arm around her shoulders. "We won." Over the next few days, the homestead transformed from battlefield back to home. Dr. and Mrs. Chen stayed to ensure Jacob and the wounded attacker were stable. Tommy Reeves rode to Canyon Post to fetch the territorial marshal, returning 3 days later with the lawman and 2 deputies who were decidedly not sympathetic to the Taylor brothers' version of events. The marshal took statements from everyone, examined the bodies, and listened to the wounded man's confession. He was a hard man who'd seen every kind of frontier violence, but even he seemed moved by the story of 5 Apache widows who'd survived massacre only to face it again. "Mr. Monroe," the marshal said as he prepared to leave, "you and these women acted in clear self-defense against a larger force of attackers who came onto your property with intent to kill. I'm ruling this a justified shooting. As for the original massacre at the Apache camp," his face hardened, "that's murder, plain and simple. Deputy Holloway is hereby stripped of his badge and will face charges. The surviving Taylor brothers will be arrested on sight, and this young lady," he gestured to Naomi, "and her companions have my official protection as witnesses in a federal case." After the marshal left, taking the wounded man and the bodies with him, an exhausted peace settled over the homestead. Dr. Chen pronounced Jacob well enough to travel in another week. Tala's foot had healed enough that she could walk without limping, and Elias, standing on his porch at sunset 3 days after the battle, realized that for the first time in 15 years, he felt something that might actually be happiness. That night, with everyone gathered around his table for Ruth's cooking and Mara's singing, Elias stood and cleared his throat. Conversation died as everyone turned to look at him. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice rough with emotion. about what happens next. The marshal said you're witnesses now, which means you've got federal protection. But once the trial's done, that protection ends. You'll need somewhere permanent to stay, somewhere safe. He pulled a rolled paper from his pocket and spread it on the table. It was his land deed, the document that gave him legal ownership of these 15 acres in the Colorado mountains. I'm adding all your names to this, he continued. Naomi Talakaya Mara. Ruth, you'll all be listed as co-owners of this property. That means nobody can force you off without forcing me off too. That means you've got legal standing and legal rights. That means this, he gestured around the cabin. This is your home, for as long as you want it to be. The women stared at him in stunned silence. Then Tala started crying, which set off Mara, and suddenly everyone was talking at once, asking if he was serious, asking if it was even legal, asking why he would do this. Because you're family, Elias said simply. Not by blood maybe, but by choice, which matters more. Naomi stood and walked around the table to him. In front of everyone, with no hesitation or shame, she took his face in her hands and kissed him. When she pulled back, her eyes were shining. Ask me, she said. Elias blinked, confused. What? Ask me. The question you've been waiting to ask again. Ask me now. Understanding dawned, and Elias felt his heart begin to race. Naomi, he said, taking her hands in his, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me here, in this place we defended together? Will you let me spend the rest of my days proving that you made the right choice when you walked up to my gate that night? Yes, Naomi said, smiling through tears. Yes to all of it. The cabin erupted in cheers and laughter. Dr. Chen produced a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion. Mei Chen insisted on planning the wedding immediately. Tommy Reeves played a harmonica he'd brought from his saddlebag, and even Jacob managed to sit up and toast the happy couple. As the celebration continued around them, Elias and Naomi slipped outside for a moment of quiet. The stars were brilliant in the clear mountain air, and the snow glowed pale blue in the moonlight. I love you, Elias said, pulling Naomi close. I know I don't say it enough, but I do. More than I thought I could love anything. I love you too, Naomi replied. You saved my life, Elias. Not just that first night, but every day since. You reminded me that the world has good in it, that people can choose kindness over cruelty, that home isn't a place, it's the people who refuse to give up on each other. They stood together under the stars, two people who'd survived the worst and found the best in each other, making promises without words that they'd keep for the rest of their lives. Behind them, the cabin glowed with warmth and light and the sound of family. Not the family either of them had been born into, but the family they'd chosen. The family they'd fought for, the family they'd built together in the space between survival and hope. The winter wasn't over yet, but spring was coming. And when it arrived, it would bring new beginnings, new growth, and a future that neither Elias Monroe nor Naomi had dared to dream of a month ago, a future built on courage and defiance, and the stubborn insistence that love could flourish even in the coldest, harshest places if you were willing to fight for it. 2 weeks after the battle, Elias rode down to Wolf Hollow, with Naomi beside him, and the land deed folded carefully in his coat pocket. The town had changed since the night the Taylors fell. Or perhaps it was just that Elias was finally seeing it clearly. Where before he'd noted only the necessary businesses and avoided eye contact, now he saw the way people watched them ride past, some with hostility, but others with cautious curiosity. The territorial marshal had been true to his word. Deputy Holloway was in custody awaiting trial, and the two surviving Taylor brothers had been arrested trying to flee to Wyoming territory. The story had spread through the surrounding counties like wildfire, how 5 Apache widows and a hermit scout had defended themselves against 7 armed attackers and won. Some called it murder. Others called it justice. Most just called it the kind of violence that happened when good men stayed silent too long. At the land office, a nervous clerk named Patterson took Elias's deed with shaking hands. He read through the addendum Elias had written in careful script, listing all 5 women as equal co-owners of the property, and his eyes grew wide. Mr. Monroe, Patterson said carefully, I'm not sure this is legal. Adding Indians to a land deed, there are laws about that, regulations. Show me the regulation, Elias said flatly. Show me where it says that women who defended their home against murderers can't own the land they bled for. Patterson shuffled papers nervously, acutely aware that the woman standing beside Elias bore a fresh scar from violence and eyes that had seen too much death. Well, I suppose if you're all listed as a household and if the marshal has granted them witness protection status, then technically you can file this deed exactly as written, Elias interrupted. Or I can ride back to Canyon Post and ask the territorial marshal why his protected witnesses are being denied their legal rights. The clerk filed the papers. As they left the office, Naomi squeezed Elias's hand. You didn't have to do that. We would have survived without the deed. Surviving isn't enough anymore, Elias replied. I want you to have what you deserve. What James wanted for you, a place to call home that nobody can take away. They walked down the main street of Wolf Hollow, and Elias noticed something that made him pause. Old Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store, was watching them from her doorway. When their eyes met, instead of turning away, she nodded once, a small gesture but deliberate. At the edge of town, 3 men who worked at the sawmill tipped their hats as Naomi passed. Near the church, a woman Elias didn't recognize stopped sweeping her porch to stare, then slowly raised her hand in greeting. Not everyone was hostile. Not everyone had sided with the Taylors. Some people, it seemed, had simply been waiting for someone to stand up first. At the mercantile, Elias bought supplies for the wedding real coffee. White sugar bolts of cloth that Ruth and Mara could sew into something appropriate, and a small gold ring that the proprietor sold him at cost when he heard what it was for. The proprietor, a man named Davies who'd never spoken more than necessary to Elias before, counted out change carefully and then added an extra pound of coffee to the order. No charge for that, Davies said gruffly. Consider it a wedding present, and Mr. Monroe... He hesitated, then continued. What you did up there, standing against Bill Taylor and his crew, that took guts. Some of us have been afraid of those boys for too long. Maybe it's time that changed. On the ride back up the mountain, Naomi was quiet for a long time, staring at the ring on her finger. Just a simple gold band, nothing fancy, but it caught the sunlight and threw it back in flashes that looked like promises. I never thought I'd wear a ring again, she said finally. After James died, I thought that part of my life was over. I thought I'd just be someone who survived, not someone who lived. You were always someone who lived, Elias said. Even in the worst moments, even walking through snow with bare feet, you were living. You were choosing to keep going. That's the bravest thing I've ever seen. Naomi smiled, but there were tears in her eyes. James would have liked you, I think. He believed in men who stood by their principles. He would have appreciated what you did for us. I wish I could have known him, Elias said honestly. I wish a lot of things had been different. But if they had been different, we wouldn't be here now, Naomi pointed out. We wouldn't have found each other. And as much as I miss James, as much as I'll always carry him with me. She looked at Elias directly. I'm glad I found you. I'm glad we're building something new together. When they arrived back at the homestead, they found it transformed. During their absence, Dr. and Mrs. Chen had organized what could only be described as a wedding preparation frenzy. The cabin had been cleaned until it shone. Someone had strung pine boughs and dried wildflowers across the mantel. The table had been moved outside under the old spruce tree, and chairs borrowed from somewhere, probably Canyon Post, were arranged in neat rows. Ruth and Mara had been cooking for what looked like days, producing dishes that filled the cabin with smells that made Elias's mouth water. Tala, her foot finally healed enough for real work, had gathered every flower she could find that hadn't been killed by frost, weaving them into crowns and garlands. Kaya had disappeared into the forest and returned with a deer, which now hung in the shed being transformed into venison steaks for the celebration. Even the goats seemed to have caught the festive mood, bleating cheerfully and submitting to having their coats brushed by Tala, who insisted they needed to look presentable for the ceremony. When you said simple wedding, I thought you meant simple, Elias said to Mrs. Chen, who was directing operations with the efficiency of a military general. Simple would be disrespectful, Mrs. Chen replied firmly. You are joining 2 lives, creating a family. This deserves celebration. This deserves joy. After so much pain and fear, we need to remember what it feels like to celebrate something beautiful. Jacob, now well enough to walk with a cane, appointed himself unofficial minister, despite having no actual religious authority. I've been to enough weddings, he insisted. I know the important parts. And more importantly, after getting shot trying to do the right thing, I figure God and I are on good enough terms that he won't mind me presiding. The wedding was set for 2 days hence, which gave Ruth time to finish the dress she was making for Naomi. It wasn't white, Naomi had been clear about that, but a deep blue that matched the Colorado sky at twilight, with silver thread embroidered at the collar and cuffs in patterns that Mara said were traditional Apache designs for new beginnings. The night before the ceremony, the women gathered in the shed for what Mrs. Chen called a celebration of sisterhood. Elias wasn't invited, but he could hear laughter and singing drifting across the snow, and it made something warm bloom in his chest. These women who'd come to him broken and bleeding were laughing again. They were singing, they were celebrating. He sat on his porch with Dr. Chen Jacob and Tommy sharing whiskey and watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. "You're a good man, Elias Monroe," Dr. Chen said, raising his cup. "Not many would have done what you did. Opening your home, risking your life, giving away half your land." "I didn't give away anything," Elias replied. "I gained a family. That's worth more than any amount of land." "Still, Jacob said. "You could have turned them away. Most men would have. Most men did." "Then most men are cowards," Elias said flatly, "and I was tired of being one of them." They drank in companionable silence for a while, 4 men who'd found themselves on the right side of history almost by accident, simply by choosing to do what was right instead of what was easy. "What will you do now?" Tommy asked. "After the wedding, I mean. Will you stay here or go somewhere else?" "We'll stay," Elias said without hesitation. "This is home. We fought for it, bled for it. We're not giving it up because some people in town don't approve. Besides," he gestured to the mountains rising black against the star-filled sky, "there's nowhere I'd rather be. Nowhere I'd rather raise a family." Dr. Chen's eyebrows rose. "Family. Are you expecting a child?" Elias laughed. "Not yet, but someday I hope. And even if not, we've already got a family, 6 adults who chose each other, which is stronger than any blood relation." The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of crystalline winter day that made every color sharper and every sound carry farther. Elias woke early too nervous to sleep and spent the morning doing unnecessary chores to burn off energy. He checked the goat pen 3 times, brought in firewood they didn't need yet, and reorganized his tool shed for no particular reason. Finally, around midday, Mrs. Chen found him trying to repair a fence post that didn't need repairing and physically removed the hammer from his hands. "Enough," she said firmly. "You are getting married in 3 hours. Go bathe. Put on clean clothes. Try to look like a man who's about to marry the woman he loves, not one who's about to face a firing squad." Elias bathed in heated water behind the cabin, scrubbing away weeks of accumulated grime and worry. He dressed in his only good clothes, wool pants, and a shirt that Ruth had mended and pressed until it looked almost new. He even attempted to tame his beard, trimming it down to something that didn't look quite so much like a mountain man and more like someone respectable. When he emerged, Tommy Wolf whistled, and Jacob laughed. "You clean up pretty well, Monroe. Almost didn't recognize you without the crazy mountain hermit beard." As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western peaks, people started arriving, and that was the first surprise. Dr. and Mrs. Chen had somehow spread word of the wedding, and people Elias had never met began appearing on the trail. A family from Canyon Post who'd lost their son in the war and had always been kind to the Apache. An older couple who ran a trading post and had known Naomi's husband, James. 3 cowboys who worked for a ranch north of Wolf Hollow and who said they'd be damned if they'd let the Taylors represent what this territory stood for. By the time the ceremony was set to begin, nearly 30 people had gathered under the old spruce tree, their breath forming clouds in the cold air, their faces reflecting something that looked like hope. Then Naomi emerged from the shed, and Elias forgot how to breathe. The blue dress fit her perfectly, flowing around her like water, the silver embroidery catching the late afternoon light. Her long dark hair hung loose down her back, woven through with the flowers Tala had gathered. The scar on her face stood out stark against her skin, but she wore it proudly like a warrior's mark. In her hands she carried a small bouquet of pine boughs and dried sage, and her eyes. when they found Elias across the snow, were full of love and fierce determination. Ruth Maracaya and Tala walked beside her as attendants, each wearing their best clothes and carrying their own bouquets. They formed a procession that was part wedding party, part warrior delegation, and entirely beautiful. Elias stood under the spruce tree, his heart hammering so hard he thought everyone must be able to hear it, and watched the woman he loved walk toward him through the snow. When Naomi reached him, she handed her bouquet to Tala and took both his hands in hers. Jacob cleared his throat and raised his voice to carry across the gathered crowd. "We're here today because two people found each other in the darkness and decided that light was worth fighting for. We're here because Elias Monroe opened his gate when he could have closed it, and Naomi had the courage to knock when she had every reason to expect rejection." He paused, looking between them with genuine affection. "I'm not a preacher, and I'm not going to pretend to speak for God. But I do know that what I've witnessed in this place over the past weeks is as close to a miracle as I'm likely to see in this life. I saw strangers become family. I saw fear transform into courage. I saw people who had every reason to hate choose love instead." Jacob gestured to Elias. "Elias Monroe, do you take Naomi as your wife to love and honor and stand beside through whatever trials and joys life brings?" "I do," Elias said, his voice rough with emotion. "I absolutely do." "And Naomi, do you take Elias as your husband to love and honor and stand beside through whatever trials and joys life brings?" "I do," Naomi said, clearly, her eyes never leaving Elias's face. "Then by the authority of common decency and the bonds of love that are obvious to everyone here, I declare you married. Elias, you can kiss your bride now before we all freeze to death out here." Laughter rippled through the crowd, but Elias barely heard it. He pulled Naomi close and kissed her while 30 people cheered and the mountains watched and the goats bleated their approval from their pen. When they finally separated, both were crying and both were smiling, and Elias thought that this moment right here, right now, was worth every hard year that had come before it. The celebration that followed was unlike anything the mountain had ever seen. Tables had been set up outside loaded with food that seemed to materialize from nowhere. Ruth's stews and roasted meats, Mrs. Chen's dumplings and stir-fried vegetables, venison steaks from Kaya's hunt, fresh bread and dried fruit, and someone had even produced a cake, though where they'd gotten the eggs and sugar in winter remained a mystery. People ate and drank and talked, and Elias found himself in conversations with strangers who were becoming friends. People who told him they'd been waiting for someone to stand up to the Taylors. People who said they respected what he'd done, even if it had cost him standing in Wolf Hollow. "You've got friends here," said the older man from the trading post, whose name turned out to be Samuel. "Maybe not in town proper, but out here in the territory among those of us who remember what this land was supposed to be about: freedom and second chances and the right to live without fear. You've got friends, Monroe. Don't forget that when things get hard again." As evening deepened into night, someone produced a fiddle and another a harmonica, and music filled the air. People danced in the snow-breath, steaming faces flushed with cold and whiskey and joy. Mara sang her voice soaring over the mountains in songs that made people cry, even though they didn't understand the words. Tala danced with Tommy Reeves, both of them young and laughing and beautifully alive. Elias danced with his wife still a strange and wonderful phrase under the stars, holding her close and thinking that this was what peace felt like. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of something worth protecting. "I'm happy," Naomi whispered against his chest. "I didn't think I'd ever say those words again, but I'm happy." "So am I," Elias replied, kissing the top of her head. "So am I." The celebration continued late into the night until finally the last guest departed and the homestead grew quiet. Dr. and Mrs. Chen would leave in the morning, heading back to Canyon Post. Jacob and Tommy would go with them, Jacob to testify at the trial, Tommy to start building a life that honored his brother's courage. But tonight they all remained sleeping in the shed and the cabin and anywhere else they could find space, a community created not by geography but by shared values and shared struggle. Elias and Naomi walked to the cabin they would now officially share, and at the threshold, Elias lifted her in his arms and carried her across tradition, mixing with genuine affection. Inside, the fire burned low and warm, and they were finally blessedly alone. "We did it," Naomi said, standing by the fire and looking at the ring on her finger. "We actually did it. We survived, and we fought, and we built something beautiful out of ashes." "We did," Elias agreed, coming to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist. "And now we get to live in that beauty. We get to wake up every morning and choose each other again. We get to build a life that honors everyone we've lost by refusing to give up on hope." They made love that night with tenderness and passion. Two people who'd forgotten what it felt like to be held with love and who were remembering together. And afterward, lying in the darkness with Naomi's head on his chest and her breathing soft and even, Elias felt something settle in him that had been restless for 15 years. This was home. Not the cabin or the land or even the mountains. This, the woman in his arms, the family sleeping nearby, the life they were building together, this was home. The winter gradually surrendered to spring, and the transformation was visible everywhere. Snow melted in rushing streams that fed the creek. Grass emerged green and vibrant. The goats became impossibly energetic, leaping and playing in ways that made everyone laugh. Birds returned, filling the air with songs that had been silent for months. And the homestead grew. Using lumber they cut from the forest and stone they quarried from the canyon, they expanded the cabin, adding rooms until it became a proper house. Ruth got her own space with windows facing east for the morning light. Mara claimed a corner where she could sew and sing without disturbing anyone. Kaya built herself a loft where she could see out across the valley. Tala insisted on a room near Naomi and Elias. She was healing from her trauma, but still had nightmares, and knowing family was close helped. They planted a garden that would have been impossible alone, but became manageable with 6 pairs of hands: corn and beans and squash. The 3 sisters that Ruth said every Apache garden needed: potatoes and onions and carrots, herbs for cooking and healing. They built a proper chicken coop and acquired more hens. Sherman and his companions multiplied, producing kids that Tala raised with devoted attention. Word spread through the territory about the homestead in the mountains where Apache women and a white scout had created something that looked like a working model for how different people could live together. Some dismissed it as an aberration. Others pointed to it as proof that coexistence was possible if people chose it. The trial of Deputy Holloway and the surviving Taylor brothers became territory-wide news. Jacob's testimony was devastating, describing in detail how the attack on the Apache camp had been planned and executed. The wounded man who'd survived the battle at Elias's homestead corroborated everything, adding that the Taylors had boasted about previous attacks on Apache settlements that had gone unpunished. The verdict came back guilty on all counts. Holloway was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The Taylor brothers received 20 years each and would likely die behind bars. The judge, in his closing statement, said that the territory could no longer afford to ignore violence against its Apache residents, and that the days of looking the other way were over. It wasn't perfect justice. It wouldn't bring back the murdered husbands or undo the trauma, but it was something. It was accountability where there had been none before. Summer arrived in an explosion of color and warmth. The garden flourished beyond their wildest expectations, producing enough food that they could preserve significant amounts for winter. The house was completed solid and beautiful, with real glass windows that caught the light and threw it back in rainbows. They built a schoolhouse, just a small one-room building, but Tala used it to teach herself to read with books that Dr. Chen brought from Canyon Post, and she dreamed of someday teaching other children. And on a warm August evening, with the sun setting gold and amber across the peaks, Naomi found Elias working in the garden and took his dirt-covered hands in hers. "I have something to tell you," she said, and there was something in her voice that made Elias's heart skip. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "No," Naomi said, and she was smiling, now a smile so radiant it made her look like the girl she must have been before violence taught her caution. "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. Elias, I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby." For a moment, Elias couldn't process the words. Then understanding hit, and he let out a whoop of pure joy that brought everyone running from the house, convinced something terrible had happened. When they saw him lifting Naomi and spinning her in the garden, while she laughed and scolded him to be careful, they understood, and suddenly everyone was crying and laughing and talking at once. That night they celebrated with a feast under the stars, and Mara sang songs about new life and hope, and Ruth began planning all the things a baby would need, and Kaya and Tala argued about whether it would be a boy or girl, and everyone agreed that whatever it was, it would be loved beyond measure. Elias and Naomi sat slightly apart from the celebration, his hand resting on her still flat stomach, both of them staring up at the vast sweep of stars overhead. "What do you want?" Naomi asked. "Boy or girl?" "Healthy," Elias said immediately. "Healthy and loved and growing up in a world where they never have to know the kind of hate we've seen." "That's a beautiful dream," Naomi said softly. "But not realistic. There will always be hate. There will always be people like the Taylors." "Maybe," Elias acknowledged, "but there will also always be people like us, people who choose differently. And every child raised with love and taught to see other people's humanity is one more voice against the darkness." He pulled her closer. "Our child will grow up knowing 5 extraordinary women who survived the worst and chose to build something beautiful. They'll grow up knowing that family isn't about blood, it's about choice. They'll grow up in a home where different cultures and different experiences are all valued. That's not nothing." "No," Naomi agreed, resting her head on his shoulder. "That's not nothing. That's everything." The months of Naomi's pregnancy transformed the homestead into something that felt almost magical. Ruth gathered herbs and created tonics to ease morning sickness. Mara sewed tiny clothes with embroidery so delicate it looked like artwork. Kaya built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it until it was smooth as silk. Tala excited at the prospect of being an aunt. Figure read everything Dr. Chen brought about childbirth and infant care. And Elias found himself unable to stop planning for a future he'd never allowed himself to imagine. He built toys, a wooden horse, a rattle-soft blocks carved from cottonwood. He reinforced the house against winter, determined that his child's first season would be warm and safe. He rode to town regularly now, no longer the hermit, but a respected member of the community who'd proven himself through action. Winter returned, and with it the memories of the previous year. But now those memories held different weight. They were reminders of how far they'd come, how much they'd survived, how strong they'd proven themselves to be. On a February morning when the sky was the color of pearls and the world lay hushed under fresh snow, Naomi's labor began. Mrs. Chen had arrived 2 weeks earlier to help with the birth, and she took charge with calm efficiency that made everyone feel both unnecessary and grateful for her presence. The labor was long, nearly a full day, but Naomi bore it with the same fierce determination she'd brought to everything else in her life. Elias stayed by her side, holding her hand, offering water, speaking encouragement when she needed it, and staying quiet when she needed silence. As sunset painted the snow gold and amber with the first stars appearing in a darkening sky, a baby's cry filled the cabin, strong and indignant and absolutely perfect. "A girl!" Mrs. Chen announced, placing the tiny, squalling infant in Naomi's arms. "Healthy and strong, just like her mother." Elias stared at his daughter, and felt something break and remake itself in his chest. She was impossibly small, red-faced and wrinkled and beautiful beyond words. When she wrapped her tiny hand around his finger, gripping with surprising strength, he felt tears stream down his face, unchecked. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "Welcome home." They named her Sarah after Elias's mother, who he'd barely known, but always wished he had, and gave her the middle name Running Deer for the husband and father. Naomi had lost. Sarah Running Deer Monroe. A name that carried the weight of 2 worlds and the hope that maybe those worlds could exist together in one person. The household transformed around Sarah's arrival. Everyone took turns holding her, rocking her, singing to her. Tala proved to have an unexpected talent for soothing the baby when she cried. Ruth created special foods to help Naomi recover her strength. Mara sang lullabies that mixed Apache and English words. Kaya carved protective symbols above the cradle. And Elias discovered that fatherhood suited him in ways he'd never anticipated. He could spend hours just watching Sarah sleep, marveling at her tiny fingers and the expressions that flickered across her face. When she woke crying in the night, he was always the first up, changing her and bringing her to Naomi to feed, and then sitting with both of them until they fell back asleep. Spring came again, Sarah's first, and they carried her outside to feel the sun on her face and hear the birds singing. Sherman came to investigate, sniffing the baby cautiously, and Sarah's first laugh was triggered by the goat's ridiculous beard tickling her foot. On a May afternoon with the garden blooming and the world feeling impossibly alive, visitors arrived Dr. and Mrs. Chen Jacob Reeves, who now worked for the Territorial Marshal Service, and 3 Apache families from Canyon Post, who'd heard about the homestead and wanted to see if the stories were true. They gathered under the old spruce tree where Elias and Naomi had married, and the Apache families sang traditional songs of blessing over Sarah while she slept peacefully in her mother's arms. The Chen family contributed red silk wrapped around a silver coin for prosperity. Jacob presented a carved wooden cross that his grandmother had given him, saying he wanted Sarah to have something from his family too. As the sun set and the visitors prepared to leave, the oldest of the Apache men, a grandfather whose face was deeply lined with age and experience, approached Elias and Naomi. "What you have built here," he said in careful English, "is rare and precious. A place where different peoples live as family, where old wounds begin to heal, where children can grow up knowing that the hatred of the past does not have to be the hatred of the future." He placed his hand gently on Sarah's head. "This child is blessed. She will walk between worlds and make both of them better for her presence." After everyone had left and the homestead grew quiet again, Elias stood on his porch holding his daughter, while Naomi leaned against him, both of them watching the stars emerge one by one. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Naomi asked. "When we came to your gate and you had every reason to turn us away?" "I think about it all the time," Elias replied. "I think about how close I came to closing that gate, how easy it would have been to stay isolated and alone, how I almost missed all of this because I was afraid." "But you didn't," Naomi said. "You chose differently. You chose us." "Best decision I ever made," Elias said, kissing her temple. "Bar none." Sarah stirred in his arms, making the small sounds that meant she'd wake soon and want to feed. Elias passed her carefully to Naomi and watched as his wife settled into the rocking chair he'd built the baby latching on immediately, mother and daughter silhouetted against the firelight. This was what they'd fought for. This moment of peace, this breath of contentment, this small, perfect family that had been forged in winter's crucible and tempered by spring's promise. They had survived massacre, and battle had faced down hatred with courage, had chosen love when fear would have been easier. And now they had this, a home built on the foundation of mercy and defiance, a family created by choice rather than blood, a future that sparkled with possibility instead of being darkened by the past. The mountains stood eternal around them, witnesses to the small miracle that had unfolded on their slopes. A miracle that proved that even in the harshest places, even in the coldest seasons, even when darkness seemed overwhelming, light could still find a way to break through. And that light, once kindled, once protected and nurtured by people brave enough to believe in it, could illuminate not just one cabin on a mountainside, but spread outward in ripples that touched everyone who witnessed it, proving that redemption was possible and that love in the end was always stronger than hate. Elias Monroe stood on his porch under the vast Colorado sky, listening to his daughter's soft sounds of contentment and his wife's quiet humming, surrounded by family that had chosen him as surely as he'd chosen them. And he knew with absolute certainty that he'd finally found what he'd been searching for all those years he'd spent running. He'd found home. He'd found love. He'd found the courage to be the man he'd always wanted to be but had been too afraid to become. And it had all started with 5 Apache widows appearing in the snow barefoot and bleeding, and one lonely scout who'd opened his gate when he could have kept it closed. That choice, made in a moment of compassion when cruelty would have been easier, had changed everything. Had saved not just 5 lives, but 6, because Elias now understood that he'd been dying too in his isolation, dying slowly of loneliness and guilt and the weight of all his regrets. They had saved each other, really, through choice and courage and stubborn refusal to let violence and hatred define their futures. They had built something no storm or rumor or prejudice could destroy, a home born from mercy, defiance, and love that had grown deeper and stronger with every challenge they'd faced together. And as stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and the night deepened around the warm circle of light that spilled from the cabin windows, Elias Monroe smiled and went inside to join his family, closing the door gently behind him on a past that no longer haunted him, and opening his heart fully to a future that promised nothing but uncertainty except for the one certainty that mattered most. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And that was enough. That was everything. That was home.